Hello, listeners! Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's golden age and the few years surrounding it. I am your host, Erin Carlson. Okay, for this episode that drops on New Year's Eve, I wanted to cover an individual who really knew how to party. And who better than one of Hollywood's most infamous party animals, the Tasmanian Devil himself, Errol Flynn. Okay, I really try to keep my language cleanish on this show, but Errol Flynn has made that really difficult to do. There are some things I felt needed to be shared from my main source, a book titled Errol Flynn, Gentleman Hellraiser by David Bret, some quotes from Errol Flynn himself from his autobiography and other writings, and not really much that ever came out of Errol Flynn's mouth was appropriate. So, if you are listening around your children or are sensitive to a little rougher language or talk of a sexual nature, this episode is not for you. Grandma, you are definitely not allowed to listen to this one. Turn it off now. This is a far cry from last week's wholesome James Stewart episode. All right, everyone, pour yourself a drink, get comfortable, and buckle up tight. This is going to be a long and wild ride. Okay, here we go. Errol Leslie Thomas Flynn was born in Tasmania on June 20th, 1909. His father, Theodore, was a biologist, a very highly respected biologist. Theodore was Irish, but his parents had settled in Australia before his birth, so that's where he was brought up. Errol's mother was named Marelle. Just a few months after they were married, Theodore was asked to join a scientific expedition to the South Pole, and Marelle decided to join him. And it was on the ship that she learned she was pregnant. A cramped ship full of men on a scientific mission is not the best place to give birth, so they dumped her off in Tasmania to give birth to little Errol all alone and went on their way. Well, Marelle was pretty pissed off at the adorable little bundle of joy growing inside her body. And her resentment did not improve once her little boy was born. She was quite upset that this baby ripped away her chance of seeing and exploring Antarctica with the expedition. It was all his fault. It was several months before Theodore returned to Tasmania to gather his wife and the son that he had yet to meet. And he really liked Tasmania, so they decided to set down roots there. The baby was almost a year old, and Marelle hadn't yet bothered to give him a name. She did not like her child. So Theodore saw to it as soon as he returned that his baby would be named and baptized. Errol Leslie Thomas Flynn. Errol would later call his mom not by mom or her name, but as the C word. Yeah, you know the one. Theodore wasn't perfect himself, though. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of separations, and a lot of affairs for both of them. It simply wasn't a good marriage, and this affected Errol in very negative ways. Remember the name of the book I used for my research, Errol Flynn, Gentleman Hellraiser. Well, that little Hellraiser started at a very young age. Errol and his mother never got along. I mean, she didn't nurture or love her child at all, so how could they? Errol began acting out as soon as he could walk. When he was 5 years old, he got in trouble for playing doctors and nurses a little too intimately with a little girl at a church tea party. Ooh, I bet a few church ladies fainted at that. The next year, when he was 6 years old, Errol got in trouble for running away from home and stealing a boat to become a pirate. He was allegedly expelled from multiple schools between kindergarten and high school. He had some mistaken behaviors, as we call them in the early childhood field, to say the least. What he did excel at, though, were sports. Tennis was what he was most skilled at, but he was also in swimming, wrestling, and boxing. Needless to say, he kept his father on his toes. Likely to keep his child occupied and away from Marelle because who knows what she might do to her son, Theodore began taking Errol on expeditions with him. Theodore was one of the most respected biologists in the area and was now the professor of biology and zoology at Hobart University in Tasmania. One of his life's greatest works was tracking down the almost extinct Tasmanian Devil, and the family even kept one that he had captured as a pet at their home. A caged pet, of course. Thank God Theodore somewhat nurtured his son as well as he did, because Morell took any chance she could to tell her son that she wished he was never born. There were also reports of physical abuse against her son, and Flynn later recounted that his mother would constantly tell him to wash his penis because it was filthy and disgusting, just like sex was filthy and disgusting. Cool. This mistreatment from his mother set up Errol Flynn to have a lifelong mistrust of women and a very warped idea of sex. Mother of the Year Morell unfortunately gave birth to another child when Errol was 10 years old, this time a little girl, Sister Rosemary. It was well expressed that Rosemary was wanted while Errol was unwanted. Morell was much kinder to her daughter than she had ever been to Errol. And unfortunately, Theodore's energy and attention shifted completely over to little Rosemary as soon as she was born too. Now Errol was left all alone. No love, no nurture, no care, no attention. When Errol was 12 years old, he lost his virginity to the family's household maid while his parents were away and she had been tasked with babysitting him. Losing your virginity and being babysat should not be in the same sentence together, ever. And so began the wild sexual exploits of Errol Flynn. And a few years later, in high school, he had a fling with a female schoolmate in her 30s. I'm not a psychologist, but I think we can all see a correlation between his mother's detachment and his sexual promiscuity with older women here. Errol did finish high school, barely. He had put all of his energy into sports and sexual relationships. Oh, and literature. He loved books and he loved to write. After high school, he was not interested in college. Oh God, no. He wasn't interested in hard work. But he was interested in a rich social life and money to support that rich social life. So he used his natural charisma and good looks to live a fun social life in Sydney for a little while. A little sprinkling of manipulation and charm paid for his lifestyle. And his next adventure lay in New Guinea when he learned of the gold strike occurring there. He saw an opportunity to strike gold and become rich. Errol would end up making multiple trips to New Guinea over the next 4 or 5 years. He did some illegal trading with the locals and also allegedly set up a sort of plantation and held locals for slave labor. And he dabbled in sexual escapades with as many native women as he possibly could. He loved this extremely unconventional life of adventure. He thrived on it. He wrote in a journal entry during this time, quote, "We fritter our lives away in detail, but I'm not going to do this. I'm going to live deeply. I'm going to front the essentials of life to see if I can learn what it has to teach. And above all, not to discover when I come to die that I have not lived," end quote. Well, he lived all right. He lived among disease, deadly snakes, crocodiles, and constant danger. He had been shot at and even allegedly shot and killed a headhunter during an attack. He left his few years in New Guinea with a lot of unbelievable stories, malaria, and gonorrhea. Back in Sydney, he was persuaded to appear in a low-budget film titled In the Wake of the Bounty. It was a way to make a few bucks and nothing more to him. He still refused to settle into typical, boring working life. You know, the thing that makes a person money to survive and thrive. Work wasn't really his thing. Instead, he became cozy with the wife of a wealthy department store owner, Madge Parks, who was 20 years older than him. What she didn't provide for him, he stole from her. Diamonds and pearls. But Madge wasn't going to put up with that, no matter how good the little rendezvous was. She set the police on his tail, and Errol fled back to New Guinea with his stolen diamonds and pearls. His life in Australia was now in the past. He would never step foot on the continent again as he ran from its law. I'm sure the locals of New Guinea were pumped to have their little schmoozer back. Well, another mysterious man had rolled onto the island in Errol's absence. A vagabond Austrian doctor who specialized in tropical diseases named Hermann Urban. Urban was quite a bit older, but he had a very similar personality to Errol Flynn. He was unconventional, he was adventurous, and he was often not very honest. They were two peas in a pod. The two set off escapading together between New Guinea, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and China in a rage of gambling, drugs, questionable behavior, sexual escapades, and a short stint digging ditches with the Royal Hong Kong Volunteers during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Errol Flynn later described Urban like this in his autobiography. He wore a broad grin, showing enormous teeth parted. His ears were monsters that stood out at about the angle of the enraged elephant about to charge. His face was covered with blonde hair. His bare legs and thighs showed the same hirsuteness, so that he looked like a blonde, amiable orangutan in a mink coat. Tell us how you really feel, Errol Flynn. Contrary to this very detailed and unflattering description, Hermann Urban was not a hideous-looking human being. It turns out he's a hideous human being, but his appearance isn't that god-awful. We can't all have Errol Flynn good looks. Anyways, Errol and his buddy Herman loved brothels. The heart and soul of any city is its whorehouses, he would say. Man, I've traveled to dozens of cities abroad, and I haven't stepped foot in one brothel. And here I thought I was a cultured world traveler. One trip to a brothel in Sri Lanka didn't have the happy ending Errol Flynn had envisioned. Instead, he was stabbed in the gut by the rickshaw boy who had escorted them to the establishment after Flynn refused to give him a tip. He later loved to show off this battle scar by dropping his trousers at parties to reveal his 9-inch-long knife wound that stretched from his scrotum to his navel. The one lesson Errol Flynn took from this brothel stabbing was that he had to value life. This was a close call, and it was a wake-up call for him. Well, not really to value life, but to value his dick. I'll let him explain. Quote, I've lived for, with, and by my balls. I learned to value my balls so much that possibly I decided to make continual use of them, in the event some small man might one day succeed where this one almost did, end quote. So basically, the lesson he learned was that he needs to have as much sex as humanly possible because you never know when someone might cut your dick off. 25-year-old Errol Flynn was now at a crossroads in his life. He began dreaming of that little brush of excitement he'd had on screen in Sydney, and he wanted some more of that. He'd by now landed in London and did a little stage work on the West End and at least one British quota quickie film. Never one to stay in one place too long, Errol then headed up to do some stage work in Northampton. The only reason I mentioned this little relocation amongst the countless other relocations is because of some trouble he got into in the home he rented a room in there. There was a shoe factory across the street from the home of Mr. and Mrs. Kemp, whose home Errol was staying. Each morning, as the young women who worked at the factory lined up at the gates for the start of their shift, Errol Flynn would be up in his bedroom window, buck naked, doing a hula dance while masturbating and belting out his favorite song. This stunt landed the cops at the Kemp store multiple times after reports of gross indecency. Errol was having a blast. It doesn't seem like anyone else was enjoying it much, though. The Kemps, not surprisingly, evicted him and lost out on several weeks' back rent in the process. Moving on now, or we'll be here all day with this guy. Every single day was an adventure for Errol Flynn. Let's fast forward to his next adventure, Hollywood, USA. Word had gotten back to Jack Warner of Warner Brothers Studio about the dashing stage actor in London who wasn't particularly talented, but had tons of charisma, energy, and good looks. Those things were way more important than talent back in those days. Errol Flynn boarded the SS Paris in November of 1934, bound for America. The dashing ladies' man made quite a splash on the ship voyage over, especially with a French actress named Lily Demita. Lily was gorgeous, famous, and rich, just Errol Flynn's type. They rendezvoused together on the voyage and then went their separate ways once docked in New York. Not too long after they both made it to their final destination in California, though, they bumped into each other again. Lily was residing at the infamous Garden of Allah Hotel on the Sunset Strip, and it was there that the famous partying of Errol Flynn's Hollywood life would kick off. He attended tons of soirees and parties at the Garden of Allah, and most of the wild stories of these parties are completely lost to history, never to have ever been known by us. But I'm sure they were epic and fantastic. You can be sure that at these parties, Errol Flynn participated in tons of drinking, probably dabbled in some drugs, and absolutely engaged in countless sexual experiences with both women and men. It was at the Garden of Allah where Errol Flynn and David Niven first crossed paths, and it's highly speculated as to whether or not a sexual relationship began. David Niven said no. Errol Flynn said yes. Either way, it was really not so uncommon in old Hollywood for same-sex sexual relationships to occur. Lily DeMita was reportedly bi also, as were tons of other actors and actresses. It was just all very hush-hush outside of their small social circles. Errol Flynn was very candid in expressing his desire to take pleasure wherever and from whomever he could get it. Well, studio execs did not like these same-sex relationships, and they would do anything they could to cover them up. The go-to cover-up was a lavender marriage. So it was mostly Jack Warner who decided that his new up-and-coming leading man was to marry his stunning French girlfriend, Lily DeMita. Errol and Lily were married on Errol's 26th birthday, June 20th, 1935. That man had lived a lot of life so far in 26 years. Errol had a couple of very small parts after his arrival in LA, and then Jack Warner took a chance on this new handsome face with an eclectic, charismatic energy, and cast him in the studio's largest production of the year of 1935, Captain Blood. And you may recall that this film also debuted another new Warner Brothers star, Olivia de Havilland. Captain Blood paired up Flynn and de Havilland for the first time, and their amazing on-screen chemistry would ensure their pairing for 7 more films together down the road. They had set off into stardom together, and they both had deep, deep crushes on each other. Of course, the great Olivia de Havilland would never intrude on his marriage, and I think Errol Flynn respected her too much to push her too hard to do so. She may be the only woman that he ever did respect. Errol Flynn became an overnight star with Captain Blood. He was the captivating, magnetic, adventurous hunk moviegoers craved. And behind the camera, he was raunchy, rude, inappropriate, unprofessional, and very difficult to work with. He didn't bow down to anyone, and he didn't follow anyone's rules. He was going to do what he wanted to do whenever he wanted to do it. Errol and Lily had a starry Hollywood dream marriage in the public's eye, but behind closed doors, things were anything but a dream. They had one of those fiery, passionate connections that was sometimes really, really good in their adventures in and out of the bedroom. But on the flip side, it was really, really nasty when things got heated. Errol later said that he often thinks of Lily DeMita when he thinks of the holes she left in his head, referring to the multitude of dishes she cracked over his head during their heated arguments. Apparently, she was well known for throwing anything in reach at her husband during their fights. I'm sure some of these fights were over Errol's affairs. You didn't think he could actually maintain a monotonous relationship, did you? His most consistent affair partner at the time was a co-star from Captain Blood, Ross Alexander. Ross had also had a couple of lavender marriages to cover up his sexuality, and sadly both he and his second wife later died by suicide at a young age. Ross was only 29 years old when he died. I can't say for sure, but I'm guessing the pressures of Hollywood's image of him and not being able to live his true life had a huge part to do with his emotional turmoil. I did read, however, that part of the reason is speculated to be because he was afraid Ronald Reagan was signed to Warner Brothers as a ploy to replace him, leading Errol Flynn to have a lifelong hatred of Ronald Reagan. Shortly after his overnight success with Captain Blood, Errol Flynn and Lily DeMita's marriage had taken about all it could handle. It either needed to end or one of them was going to end up dead. So Errol Flynn packed his bags and moved in with his friend David Niven. The Santa Monica beach house the two sex-crazed party animals resided at was next to the beach house that William Randolph Hearst had bought for his lover Marion Davies. And it was appropriately named Cirrhosis by the Sea. Again, I couldn't find any first-hand accounts from the wild parties that took place at Cirrhosis by the Sea, but judging by the bungalow's name, I can only assume they were epic. Hearst and Davies were known for their lavish parties next door, too. So you'd think Errol Flynn would be happy and content with this new life of instant fame and wealth, partying away in the sparkling dreamland of Hollywood, wouldn't you? Nah, he needed more adventure in his life. Real adventure, not the fictionalized adventure he created on studio lots. Just a year after his big debut in Hollywood, Errol set off on his new adventure. He joined the Spanish Civil War. He literally walked right into a war zone, intentionally. That's the level of adventure this man desired. And he paired up again with his old pal Herman Urban for this one. They spent their time in Spain as war correspondents for William Randolph Hearst, in combat zones in constant danger. Errol had always loved writing. Just think about it. He had that vivid, imaginative spirit, the perfect type of mind to spill its thoughts out onto paper. He wanted to share his thoughts, and he wanted to share a deeper message to the world. The message of what he learned while he was in Spain. The oncoming threat of fascism on the horizon. While Errol Flynn was a writer, his friend Herman Urban was a photographer, so they would collaborate together. Errol would write of the war, and Herman would take photographs to accompany the work. Tragically, against Errol's knowledge, Herman Urban later turned many of those photographs over to the Nazi headquarters in Berlin, and many of the men in those photographs were persecuted by the Nazis. Herman Urban was a Nazi spy. There has been much speculation over the years of whether or not Errol Flynn knew about Herman Urban's involvement in the Nazi Party, or had knowledge of the horrific use of that photographic material. But there is absolutely no evidence that he had any idea. He wanted peace in the world, and that was one of the reasons he dropped everything to set out to a war zone. He wanted to share his knowledge with the world. He was betrayed by his friend. Errol Flynn wasn't in Spain very long, so he jumped right back into his life as a leading man movie star as soon as he set foot back on U.S. soil. The penniless Tasmanian vagabond was now the most famous man on the planet, and very, very wealthy. And he lived a life only a wealthy man can. Party central all the time. While Errol Flynn was flying high on the social scene, he was still technically married to Lily, but the marriage had essentially crumbled to nothing. They were basically only married on paper. The toxic state of their marriage had destroyed it beyond repair. That and the countless affairs. Errol Flynn was banging any person he could. It's kind of funny. Errol's daughter Deirdre said in one of the documentaries I watched, quote, "Women chased him. He really didn't chase women," end quote. That's so funny that she's defending him like that. I mean, he could have said no, right? Errol and Lily continued on in a highly dramatic on-again, off-again relationship for the next year or so, mostly off. Errol lived his life like a sex-crazed bachelor and just met back up with Lily when it was convenient for him, which was not often. The two did manage to conceive a child during this long, toxic ending of their relationship, though. Just what they needed. Errol was filming The Seahawk in 1940, and Lily stormed onto the set one day and announced loudly, quote, "Flynn, you think you've screwed every dame in Hollywood, but now I've screwed you, my friend. You will have a child," end quote. Errol responded to this wonderful news by going out and getting hammered, followed by a week-long, quote, boys-only trip on his yacht. I bet there were girls too. Oh, and his parents had traveled all the way to LA to visit their son during this time, so he ditched out on them too. Apparently, when they had first arrived, his father Theodore walked in on Errol having sex with a woman in his dressing room, and he told his father, "Just sit down, Dad, this won't take long." Little Sean Flynn was born on May 10th, 1941. Poor little guy was born into a life of volatility and instability. Errol wasn't present for his birth. He was on his yacht. Shocking, I know. He returned to land to pose for a few publicity shots of the happy little family, and then he returned to his yacht. He had absolutely no interest in being a present father. Errol and Lily finally officially divorced a few months later after a long and nasty divorce battle. With his newfound freedom, Errol set out on a period as the bachelor of all bachelors. He built an impressive 11-acre estate in the hills that was designed with entertaining and sex parties in mind. This would be his very own Playboy Mansion, before the Playboy Mansion was even a thing. He named his estate Mulholland Farm, and it sat off the steep and windy Mulholland Drive overlooking the San Fernando Valley. I'll talk more about this house in a bit. A lot of crazy shit happened on that piece of property. And everything was centered around one thing: sexual adventure. I dug deep looking for stories from Errol Flynn's infamous parties, but he built his home far removed from everything else for a reason: privacy. We will never know the insane shit that happened on that property, and a lot of it we probably don't want to know. There was one wild Errol Flynn party story that is floating around out there, though, and boy, is it a doozy. Actor John Barrymore was just as much a boozer as Errol Flynn, maybe even more so. He died in 1942 after years of heavy drinking that led to liver cirrhosis, kidney failure, and other complications. Well, Errol Flynn and a couple of buddies wanted to party with the stage and screen legend one last time. So, as the story goes, they snuck into the morgue and bribed the caretaker to let them borrow John just for a couple hours. So they took the corpse of John Barrymore to the estate, propped him up against a poker table, and had one more round of drinks with him before returning him to the morgue. Of course, this is a very outlandish story, and it is disputed by many, obviously. But John Barrymore's granddaughter, Drew Barrymore, swears that it is indeed true. I think she wants it to be true. When he wasn't partying, having sex, or drinking with dead people, Errol was writing. He loved writing. He wrote 2 books, a novel titled Beam's End, and his wildly entertaining autobiography titled My Wicked, Wicked Ways. That was a bit later on, though. And he continued to sail on his huge, elegant yacht. More opportunity for entertaining the ladies. Unfortunately, many of these ladies were not ladies at all. They were teenage girls. Okay, let's talk about this. Having sex with underage girls, and boys actually, but mostly girls, was a huge problem for him that he couldn't stop and frankly didn't want to stop. According to him, it wasn't his fault. Not much ever was. It began innocently, well, innocently in his eyes, with him sitting in his car outside of Hollywood High School watching the high school girls. Again, this is wrong, very wrong. But he thought it was completely innocent because he was simply looking and not touching. But then, as these things do, it did escalate to touching. And a 30-something man cannot have sex with underage girls because it's against the law. You know, all of that business about the frontal cortex still developing at all. The part of the brain that is responsible for reasoning and responsible decision-making. Errol Flynn didn't mind if these girls weren't able to make sound decisions and did things that they would maybe later regret. He didn't mind taking advantage of their naivety. He used his suave powers of manipulation to seduce them and do what he wanted with them, only to discard them once he got what he wanted. And this behavior landed him on trial for 4 counts of statutory rape in late 1942, when he was 33 years old. If convicted, he faced up to 10 years in prison. 17-year-old Betty Hansen was at Flynn's estate for a tennis and swimming party. She mentioned to Flynn that she didn't feel well, so he brought her into the home to, quote, rest. He undressed her and had sex with her twice. She was not a willing partner, and she testified that she did try to fight him off. The poor girl was sick and thought that he was really trying to help her, but he did the opposite. The other incidents occurred on Errol's yacht. Of these girls, Flynn said in his memoirs, quote, if you meet a young lady who invites herself on a trip on your yacht, knowing in advance full well what the risks are, who the hell asks for her birth certificate, especially if she is built like Venus? And if afterward she tells you she had the most wonderful time, who has been hurt?" End quote. Again, Mr. Flynn, that pesky frontal lobe development. Another testament to that, on the day Errol Flynn's trial began, teenage girls were lined up outside his estate, begging him to do to them what he had done to the girls he was going on trial for. That right there proves the level of maturity that we're dealing with. Now, today, I am confident that we would have a much different outcome from a case of a 33-year-old man having sex with multiple teenage girls. But unfortunately, in 1942, it wasn't seen as that big of a deal. Errol Flynn was acquitted. He is quoted as saying, quote, "Rape to me meant picking up a chair and hitting some young lady over the head with it and having your wicked way. I haven't done any of these things," end quote. Police officers had to explain to him what statutory rape meant. Plus, Mr. Flynn, rape doesn't have to be violent. So Errol Flynn had escaped punishment for his actions once again. Not only that, but at the very courthouse at which his trial was held, at the conclusion of his trial for statutory rape, he met the woman who would soon become his second wife. I'm sorry, the girl who would become his second wife. 18-year-old courthouse cigarette girl, Nora Eddington. Legally, Errol could be in a relationship with her, but come on, she was 18. Errol Flynn and Nora began a sexual relationship, and soon Nora was pregnant. Since she was raised Catholic, abortion was absolutely not an option. She told Errol she wanted him to marry her so their child could have a name and some legitimacy, and that he would be free to go about with his philandering and wild lifestyle. He could do and see who he pleased as long as he provided for her and their child. Nora recalled, quote, "This was what I wanted. I wanted a family, I wanted a home. And it never took away from him what he wanted. But before I moved in, I did say one thing to him. I said, I know the kind of life that you like, and I know what goes on at that studio, and I know that you can't pass up a pretty face. But just don't bring it home to the dinner table. And don't ever humiliate me." And he never did, end quote. Nora had her second child with Errol Flynn, daughter Rory, 2 years later in 1947. According to Nora, Errol said he wanted nothing to do with their children until they were able to communicate with him. Once that point came, Errol's daughter Deirdre recounted him as a loving but extremely strict father. He expected his daughters to always be charming and courteous, to speak when spoken to, and always have the very best manners, to be proper at all times, like him. But they were allowed to be improper if it was their father's idea. He would engage them in things like sneaking into amusement parks without paying and stealing china from restaurants, slowly seeping into his children his own devious ways. Another example of the Errol Flynn style of parenting, when his son Sean was a young teenage boy, like 14 or 15, Errol chastised him for not yet having sex with his girlfriend. In a letter he wrote to his son, Errol said, quote, "You needed $100. I added an extra $25 for condoms and or flowers," end quote. Okay, now back to the partying. That's what we're here for, right? This episode comes out on New Year's Eve, the biggest party day of the year, but every day was New Year's Eve for Errol Flynn. Especially once his exclusive Mulholland farm was built, his own personal playhouse, far separated from the homes of other stars of the day. The estate consisted of a large home, a swimming pool, tennis court, a barn, and his own private casino building. The home was beautiful. Pine tongue and groove walls with tons of windows to let in natural light throughout the home. But beyond that light lay a darker side. Flynn had secret peepholes and two-way mirrors installed for his own voyeuristic purposes, and secret passageways throughout the home. He was well known for his hedonistic sexual appetite, and he had his home built to fit that lifestyle and provide the perfect layout for his wild parties and sexual underground. When Flynn married Nora and had children with her, he just built a new wing onto the home for them so he could remain undisturbed in his party house and his lifestyle. He was never going to be willing to settle down and stop partying. By the late 1940s, though, the hard-partying lifestyle had begun to take its toll on the young, dashing Errol Flynn. He was only in his mid-30s, but he'd put his body through years of sleep deprivation, heavy drinking, and increasingly regular drug use. He even allegedly put cocaine on the tip of his penis to enhance his and his partner's sexual experiences. He'd always said about the drugs that he didn't want to leave this world without trying everything. So, he tried everything. He proudly said he would shoot up with anything. He thought he was strong enough to take drugs when he wanted to and put his drug use aside as he pleased. But addiction doesn't work like that, and Errol Flynn was an addict. And that addiction affected his life greatly, and not in good ways. He became irrational, unstable, and abusive. It wasn't pretty. Errol and Nora divorced on July 7, 1949, after 7 years of marriage. And 11 days later, Nora married singer Dick Haymes. When asked by a reporter shortly later if he would ever consider getting married again, Errol Flynn responded, quote, "Isn't that a bit like asking a man who's been circumcised without anesthetic if he'd like to go through with it again?" End quote. Well, he changed his tune, I guess, because 41-year-old Errol Flynn married a 24-year-old actress named Patrice Wymore just a year later on October 23, 1950 in Monte Carlo. Patrice's bridesmaids were extras from the film that Errol was currently working on, all 4 of which her brand new husband had very recently had sex with during filming. Errol recounted his new wife like this when he first met her, quote, "No great shakes in the looks or upholstery department. It was the glasses that did it. As soon as Pat took them off, I fell for her. Hook, line, and scrotum." End quote. So romantic. On the very same day of his marriage to Patrice, at their wedding reception in Monte Carlo actually, Errol was arrested and charged again with rape, this time with a 15-year-old girl. During the hearing, when Errol Flynn was asked if he had sex with the 15-year-old girl, he pointed straight at her in the courtroom, laughed, and loudly proclaimed, quote, "Who in their right mind would want to be seen in public with that, let alone have sex with it? She's ugly and she's got hairs on her legs. Credit me with at least a little taste, Your Honor." End quote. The case was thrown out, and Errol Flynn had once again gotten away with the crime of rape. Wow, let's take a moment to reflect on that shit. That poor girl. Errol and Patrice had a little girl they named Arnella in 1953. Errol Flynn was now the father of 4 children. Flynn was also in trouble financially. He owed money to the IRS, various unsettled debts, and to his 2 ex-wives. And his business manager was stealing from him. Instead of dealing with this, Errol Flynn did what he did best. He fled. He bought some property in Jamaica and commissioned his parents to oversee the building of his estate there. He and his mother were getting along as good as they always had, which was not at all. She chastised him for sunbathing nude all the time. So what did Errol Flynn do? He began showing up to the dinner table with his mother, completely nude with a full-fledged erection for every single meal. Errol did eventually return to LA to face the music. When encouraged to sell his beloved yacht to help pay for his mounting debts, he said he would, quote, "sooner sell my wife." And I believe without a doubt that to be true. Now approaching 50, Errol Flynn was aging much more rapidly than he could have been if he'd chosen to live his life a little differently. But there was never any chance of that happening. He set forth into life at full speed and had no intention of slowing down or obeying any rules, including those pesky rules about grown-ass men having sex with underage girls. He just couldn't shake that one. That rule didn't apply to him, as proven by the judges and juries who set him free from prosecution of it. While traveling in Rio de Janeiro, local newspapers reported of a drunken Errol Flynn caught in a compromising position with a 19-year-old girl, and another incident where he drunkenly chased a young Japanese tourist up a tree and tried to pull her panties down. Where was his wife? Oh, she was back on the yacht nursing their baby. Errol Flynn couldn't escape his horrible financial troubles any longer. In October of 1955, he was forced to sell his beloved Mulholland farm. The end of an era. Well, guess what? Nobody wanted his crazy sex palace with all of its secret passageways and deceitful voyeurism mirrors. So his first wife, Lily DeMita, was given the house in exchange for back alimony that she was owed. Here's a wild story for you. In the summer of 1956, Errol took his wife and teenage son Sean on a trip on the yacht. A group of people broke in the middle of the night while they were docked in Spain, and Errol Flynn beat the shit out of the men, knocking almost all of the teeth out of one of them. Buck naked, of course. Well, the next morning, his punching hand was swelled up to twice its size. He'd had his fair share of fistfights over the years, and this was not normal. Well, it turned out he had contracted some kind of blood poisoning caused by bacteria from the man's teeth. He slipped into a coma and almost had to have his entire arm amputated. Wild. Not surprisingly, the marriage between Errol and his third wife was not all sunshine and rainbows, and it had crumbled after only a few years. He'd been cheating on her with anyone he possibly could, and his drinking and drug use had definitely not slowed down. Errol Flynn began relationships with not one but two teenage children at this point. One was a 17-year-old boy named Jack, and the other a 15-year-old girl named Beverly. Some sources say 14. Errol Flynn was 48 years old. He publicly courted Beverly around, and Jack was kept as a secret little fuck buddy for whenever Errol needed him. Errol called Beverly his little wood nymph, and his mother referred to her as, quote, my son's latest jail fodder. It was during this time that Errol Flynn began work on his autobiography. He was constantly drunk, and he knew he was dying. Also during this time, his home in Jamaica, where his father had stored his extremely precious books and collections from his life's work, mysteriously burned down. The insurance payout was exactly the amount Errol Flynn needed to pay off his most recent debts. Interesting. Errol Flynn knew he was dying. He knew the vodka, opium, and cigarettes he constantly pumped into his body was killing it, and the party was almost over. So he just kept on doing it, living each day like it was his last, until the day came when it was indeed the last. The last time ex-wife Nora saw Errol, she couldn't believe what she saw. He was almost unrecognizable. The drugs and alcohol were killing him slowly. The doctor told him he had 1 year left to live. Don't worry about me, he told her. I've lived twice. Friend Joe Hyam said of his last dinner with Flynn, quote, his nose was tremendous, his eyes were bloated and piggish, his skin was veined and purplish, his hands shook. He just was a grotesque caricature of what I had seen in the movies and what I had seen just 5 years earlier. We talked for a while, and he talked in the most tawdry manner about this young lady he was living with at the time. And this conversation was profane and vulgar and unpleasant, and he drank all through the meal. It was a very, very sad scene, end quote. Errol Flynn died on October 14th, 1959, at the tragically young age of 50 years old. His official cause of death was a massive heart attack, but the coroner said he was shocked at what he saw during the autopsy. He said his body was that of a 75 to 80-year-old man. He had destroyed all of his vital organs through his lifestyle. He was surprised Errol Flynn had survived as long as he did. Errol Flynn's final resting place was a plot at Forest Lawn Cemetery. Flynn had told reporters that he wanted written on his tombstone, if it moved, Flynn fucked it. But he lay in an unmarked grave for 20 years until his children commissioned a headstone in 1979. His estranged wife Patrice had made the arrangements for his funeral, and she did not purchase a stone for him. She also had his casket adorned with yellow roses, which he detested. For those of you who listen regularly, you know that I usually skate over a subject's careers pretty quickly and focus primarily on their early lives and their lives behind the scenes. Errol Flynn gave us so much dirt to work with that I feel like I really skated over his career. I mean, I barely talked about it. To sum it up, after his success with Captain Blood in 1935, He was a superstar on the screen as an action hero, a love-fueled leading man, and a brave and mighty sword-slashing swashbuckler. His greatest hits aside from Captain Blood were The Adventures of Robin Hood, The Seahawk, Dodge City, and The Charge of the Light Brigade. The last chapter of his career was spent playing aging, washed-up drunks. Art imitating life very closely. He had always been difficult to work with. He did what he wanted on set, and he didn't care if it affected anyone else. And he drank excessively. When he was told by Warner Brothers execs to stop bringing booze to work, he began bringing crates of oranges and was found devouring the oranges on set all day long. Everyone was so proud of him for this extreme turn of events that he was focusing on nourishing his body instead of attacking it with alcohol. Well, unbeknownst to everyone on set until much later, he was injecting vodka into those oranges with a syringe. And the coffee he drank to accompany those oranges was spiked with cognac. Of course he wasn't going to follow the rules. Errol Flynn lived life hard. He lived it his way, which usually wasn't a great way. But he was happy, and to him, that's all that mattered. Now I would like to share some other interesting facts I learned during my research. Can you believe there's more? Bullet point number 1. There is a made-for-TV movie based on Errol Flynn's autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways. It's out there on YouTube if anybody is interested in it. I didn't watch it because I'm looking for facts with my research, and I have an idea the movie was very romanticized, like the book is thought to be. Bullet point number 2. Errol Flynn's oldest child, son Sean, became a war correspondent as his father had. He set off to cover the Vietnam War. The 29-year-old was reported as missing on April 6, 1970, and presumed dead. His mother Lily kept his apartment as is for over a decade, so it would be ready for him when he returned. He never returned. Bullet point number 3. All 3 of Errol Flynn's daughters became models, and his daughter Deirdre went on to be a stunt woman in Hollywood. His youngest daughter, the child he had with his third wife Patrice, sadly fell into a life of addiction like her father. She was found dead in 1998 at the age of 45. Bullet point number 4. Mulholland Farm was eventually sold. After a couple of different owners, it was purchased by singer Ricky Nelson, Ozzie and Harriet's son. His twin sons, Gunnar and Matthew, of the early 90s Nelson fame, do you remember that band? Grew up in that house. God, I was so jealous of their hair. The home and outbuildings were demolished in 1988. The property was divided, and I read that Justin Timberlake currently lives in the estate at the top of the property where Flynn's home was. I found the real estate listing, and it last sold for $8.5 million. Bullet point number 5. Here's my Gone with the Wind reference. I feel like I haven't had one of those in a while. Errol Flynn was considered for the role of Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind, pairing him with Olivia de Havilland. I bet he would have tried everything to get Vivien Leigh into his dressing room, and I like to think she'd slap him right across the face. Bullet point number 6. The expression "in like Flynn" originated from Errol Flynn's frequent sexual escapades. The original title of his autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, was In Like Me. Man, I really like that. That's clever. Bullet point number 7. One-time BFF David Niven said of Errol Flynn, quote, "You always knew precisely where you stood with him because he always let you down. He thoroughly enjoyed causing turmoil for himself and his friends." End quote. In conclusion, Errol Flynn lived about the most wild, unconventional life one could live. He broke the law, he cheated, he stole, he manipulated, he took advantage, he seduced, he raped. And he never hid any of that, well, most of it. Nor did he apologize for it. That was him, and he was completely comfortable being him. I tried to dig up as many facts as I possibly could, but there are so many stories out there about Errol Flynn, many which began as rumors and have been rolled around in a great big game of telephone through the decades, and many just urban legends or tall tales dreamed up by generations existing long past the days of Errol Flynn's carousing. The conclusion I've come up with is this. Yes, I tried to use as many cold, hard facts as I could, because I am a writer and I want to responsibly share information. But then I feel the presence of Errol Flynn. You know, like the old angel on one shoulder and devil on the other, tempting you between good and evil. Well, I have a little mini-me as a responsible writer on one shoulder, and on the other, I have Errol Flynn dressed as Robin Hood pressuring me to spill all those nasty rumors out to you. Because I think Errol Flynn really wanted his legacy to be filled with as many outrageous, deviant, unbelievable tales as possible. Luckily for us, many of them are actually true, so I could share them with you. And in the end, that's what I used. Except the John Barrymore story. Errol Flynn said it was true, and Drew Barrymore says it's true, so take it as you will. If nothing else, it's a great story. Errol Flynn stomped on the Hollywood establishment, and the code of ethics that actors were expected to adhere to, well, he had no idea what ethical behavior was. He laughed at such nonsense. Rules were not for him. As biographer Jeff Myers said, Errol Flynn had, quote, a love of adventure, a love of danger, love of skating on thin ice, love of doing something that was illegal with the possibility of getting away with it. This attitude of, I don't give a damn about anything, end quote. Errol Flynn did a lot of bad things. He used and abused a lot of people. Like I said, he stole, he cheated, he lied, he manipulated. But still, many people who encountered him during their lives had nothing but good things to say about him. Errol Flynn used his charismatic charm to cast a spell on everyone he met. A spell so powerful that he could do as he pleased with little to no consequences. That kind of manipulation is one of the most terrifying personality traits a person can hold. Terrifying for everyone who comes in contact with it. To sum up his life, I love what documentarian Barry Norman said about him. Quote, he was a man whose notoriety was greater than his fame, whose fame was greater than his talent, whose talent and fame and notoriety lay primarily in his ability as a swordsman. And you can interpret that word whichever way you will. End quote. So this is the part where I end by saying thank you to our subject for their contribution to society, humanity, and the arts. Well, I'm really mad at Errol Flynn for his treatment of underage girls and boys. But I will thank him for this. Thank you, Errol Flynn, for showing us how to wake up every single day and live like it's your last. Yes, it got you malaria, gonorrhea, and almost thrown in prison for rape, but you seem to have a good time while doing it. For all of you out there, please have a fun and safe New Year's Eve. Have fun, but please don't have Errol Flynn fun. Happy New Year, everyone, and thank you all so much for listening. Again, I am so sorry for the far departure in language and subject matter in this episode. I really try to keep things PG, but there was no way to tell this story without getting a little spicy with the language and storylines. It's really Errol Flynn's fault. Dust off the old Ouija board and take it up with him. My main source for this episode was a book titled Errol Flynn, Gentleman Hellraiser by David Bret. His book was chock full of details, and he had really good resources, so I believe everything I read. I also used a documentary titled Tasmanian Devil, The Fast and Furious Life of Errol Flynn from Australian Flaming Star Films and Lowland Media. A BBC documentary titled Hollywood Greats with Barry Norman, I love him, from 1979. TheAltmanBrothers.com, GoldenGlobes.com, an article from Far Out Magazine by Scott Cambell from July 9th, 2024, and my old tried and true IMDB.